The plane lay still under the weight of the midday sun, the air trembling faintly above the dust. Near a shallow bend in a game trail, a small shape broke the unbroken earth. A lion cub, its fur dull, its head pressed into the ground. Flies circled lazily above its back. Its sides moved in shallow, uneven pulls of breath, each one slower than the last. The trail was empty in both directions. No prints, no sign of pride nearby. Only the faint scuff marks of small paws that had wandered here and stopped. The ranger stepped down from the track, boots sinking slightly in the soft soil. His shadow fell over the cub, but it did not stir. Kneeling, he slid his hands beneath its body. It was lighter than it should have been, ribs sharp under the skin, legs limp and dry with dust. The head rolled gently in his palm as he adjusted his grip, and for a moment he felt the faintest tremor of movement. A breath, barely there. Heat radiated from the ground, pulling the last of the animal's strength away. He unbuttoned his shirt and wrapped it around the cub, tucking it close against his chest. The fabric darkened in places where its skin was cracked from dryness. Lifting it, he felt the small pulse under his fingers. Weak. Slow. If it was left here, the sun would take it before the hour turned. "You're coming with me," he said quietly, though there was no reaction. The walk back to the vehicle cut across open grassland, the horizon wavering in the heat. The weight in his arms shifted with each step, but the cub made no sound. Occasionally, its paw twitched against his forearm, a reflex more than intention. Each movement reminded him of the stakes. If the breathing stopped, so would the chance of bringing it back. The distance to the outpost felt longer with every stride. Small birds lifted from the grass as he passed, their shadows flickering over the cub's still face. The smell of dust and dry plants filled the air, mingled with the faint, warm scent of the animal. Once he paused and knelt again, adjusting the cloth so the head rested higher, keeping the airway clear. The chest rose faintly, then fell, and for a moment he wondered if it had been the last. But another breath came, and he kept moving. By the time the track came into view, the sun had shifted toward the west. Sweat darkened the ranger's collar. His steps slowed only to keep the cub steady, never jolting it more than necessary. He could feel the fragility in its frame. Bones too thin, muscles too soft. Every sign pointed to long days without food, perhaps illness, perhaps separation from its mother for more than it could endure. The plane offered no shelter, no water, nothing to give it back the strength it needed. At the vehicle, he eased into the driver's seat without putting the cub down. The engine's vibration passed through both of them as he turned toward the outpost. Dust rolled up behind the wheels, drifting back over the trail where the cub had been found. It was leaving the place of its collapse, but survival was still far from certain. A slow recovery was possible, but only if it made it through the next few hours. As the first shade of the acacia trees appeared ahead, the ranger glanced down. The cub's eyes were still closed, its breathing still shallow. But the warmth of its body against his chest was proof that time had not yet run out. The fight was not over, but it had begun here, in the dust, under the weight of the sun. The ground between the trail and the outpost was a patchwork of loose stones, dry grass, and shallow hollows where the rains had once pooled. The ranger kept his eyes ahead, holding the cub close against his chest. The cloth of his shirt was warm now, more from his own body than the sun. But the weight inside it felt smaller with every step. The cub's breathing was a faint rhythm against his ribs, uneven and shallow, sometimes pausing long enough to draw his gaze downward in quiet fear. The heat was rising, drawing a pale shimmer above the earth. Each stride sent a small jolt through the cub's frame, and he adjusted his grip, shifting the body so the head lay higher, nose tilted slightly toward the air. Any rough movement might weaken the fragile breaths that kept it alive. A bead of sweat ran from his temple to his jaw, but he did not stop. The open plain offered nothing but exposure. Here, the sun would strip away what little life remained. His boots pressed deep into soft sand, then scraped over stones. The uneven ground slowed him, forcing careful steps. He could hear the faint rasp of the cub's breath under the rustle of grass in the wind. Each sound was a reminder that the outcome was balanced on minutes, not hours. If the cub failed before they reached the shelter, there would be nothing left to save. Once, he crouched briefly, letting the cub's body rest across his knees while he checked the tightness of the wrap. The tiny chest moved once, twice, then a pause that seemed too long. He brushed a finger against the ribs until a small exhale came, warm against his skin. "Just a little further," he murmured, adjusting the folds of the shirt before rising again. The voice was soft. Not for comfort, but to measure his own calm. A narrow slope rose ahead, the final rise before the low cluster of buildings. The climb was slow, each foot placed carefully to keep the cub steady. Heat pressed hard at his back, and the scent of dry earth rose with every step. He could see the faint outline of the water tanks now, glinting in the sun. They were close enough to make the push without stopping again. At the crest, the outpost came into full view. A few vehicles were parked under the shade of wide acacias, their shadows stretched long across the ground. The path down was loose gravel, but the sight of the shaded entrance brought a quiet pull of relief. Here there would be water. Here the cub could be set down without the sun draining the last of its strength. He crossed the final stretch quickly, boots crunching on the gravel. At the open doorway, he stepped into the cooler air without pause. Kneeling to lower the bundle onto a folded blanket already laid out on the floor. The cub's eyes stayed closed, its sides rising faintly, but the air inside was still and cool, and that alone might help it hold on a little longer. For now, they had shade. Water would come next. The fight for its life was far from finished, but at least it was no longer lying in the open, waiting for the heat to decide its fate. The small room was quiet except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the slow pull of air through the open window. The cub lay on a thickly folded blanket in the corner, its body curled loosely, paws resting without tension. Its chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, each breath almost hidden beneath the coarse fur along its ribs. The ranger sat on a low stool a short distance away, a shallow dish of water beside him. Every hour he dipped his fingers into it, letting the droplets run to the cub's lips. Sometimes the mouth parted slightly, the tongue flicking once to take in the moisture. Other times there was no response at all. The hours passed with little change. Outside, the wind carried the far-off calls of night birds and the rustle of dry leaves. Occasionally, a distant roar rolled faintly across the plain, rising and fading into the open dark. Each sound reminded him how far the cub was from the safety of its pride, from the steady warmth of a mother's body. Here, the walls kept out the sun and wind, but they could not replace the life it had lost when it fell behind. Every so often the ranger reached out, resting his palm lightly against its side to feel the rise and fall. The warmth was still there, though thinner now, as if slipping away in small pieces. He kept his movements slow, his voice low when he spoke. "Easy," he whispered once as he drew a finger across the cub's shoulder to check for injury. There were no deep wounds, only the sharp frame of an animal that had gone too long without food. In the stillness between checks, he prepared small strips of meat soaked in warm water, setting them within reach. The cub's eyes remained closed, its breathing shallow. He did not press it to eat. Forcing would waste what little energy it had left. Instead, he waited for signs of interest, for the turn of the head or a shift of the nose toward the scent. Those signs never came. The night deepened, bringing a faint drop in the heat. The air through the window was cooler now, lifting the edges of the shirt that still covered part of the cub's back. When the wind shifted, the calls outside seemed closer, a reminder that the plain was alive even under the weight of darkness. He glanced often toward the blanket. watching for any twitch of movement, any sign that the small body was fighting to stay. Just before dawn, he dipped his fingers into the water again, touching them to its mouth. This time there was the faintest stir, a soft parting of the lips, the tongue brushing against his skin. It lasted only a moment before stillness returned, but it was enough to keep him moving, enough to make him refill the dish and settle in again. The sky beyond the window was paling, and the first shapes of the plane were returning. The cub had made it through the night, but its breathing was no stronger. Morning would bring another test: warmth, food, and the slow work of keeping its life from slipping away. The hours ahead would decide if surviving the night had been enough. The first light of morning stretched pale across the room, softening the edges of the low walls and catching on the rim of the shallow water dish. The air was still cool before the sun began its climb. The cub lay where it had through the night, its body curved loosely on the folded blanket. For a long time, there was no movement beyond the faint rhythm of its breathing. Then, slowly, its head shifted, lifting a few inches from the blanket before settling again. The ranger leaned forward from the stool, watching closely. Another slow lift came, this time holding a fraction longer. The eyes remained closed, but the small muscles in its jaw flexed faintly. It was not much, but after a night where every breath had seemed uncertain, the change was sharp enough to pull him closer. He reached for the small bowl beside him. The one holding thin strips of meat softened in warm broth. Kneeling, he brought the bowl near, letting the scent drift toward the cub. At first, there was no reaction. Then its nose shifted slightly, a short movement as if drawing in the smell. He used 2 fingers to lift a piece, holding it near the mouth. For a moment, it lay still, and then the jaws parted just enough for the meat to pass through. The bite was weak, more a closing of the mouth than a chew. But it was certain, the first real attempt since it had been found. The ranger stayed still, letting it take the time it needed. The piece disappeared slowly, and the head dropped again to the blanket. He waited a full minute before offering another, but this time the reaction was slower, less clear. He withdrew the bowl, not wanting to push. A single bite would not restore strength, but it was a step back from the edge it had been balanced on since yesterday. Outside, the light was growing stronger, filtering through the window in narrow bands. The sounds of the plane were beginning to rise, the low calls of doves, the faint scrape of branches in the wind. Inside, the cub's breathing was deeper now, though still irregular. Its head rested sideways, the damp mark of broth at the corner of its mouth. The ranger returned to the stool, keeping his eyes on the slow rise and fall of its chest. If it could eat again by evening, there would be a chance to build on this moment. But the margin for survival was still thin. A missed feeding, a turn toward weakness, and the ground gained this morning would be lost by night. As the sun began to warm the room, the cub shifted one paw across the blanket, claws barely catching in the weave. It was a small movement, but paired with the bite it had taken, it marked the first sign of strength since the rescue began. For now, that was enough to keep hope in place. Fragile, but present, like the morning light spreading slowly over the plain. 3 days had passed since the cub's first bite, each one measured in small gains. A steadier breath, longer moments with its head lifted, the slow acceptance of food and water. By the 4th morning, the ranger judged it strong enough to travel. The decision came with risk. Leaving the outpost meant leaving the controlled safety of shade and regular feeding. But the prints found in the grass at dawn were fresh. Too fresh to ignore. The paw prints were light, barely pressed into the thin layer of dust between clumps of brittle grass. They angled east, toward the shallows of a dry pan, and the ranger moved carefully, keeping his steps in line with theirs. Each print held the clear outline of pads, but some showed smaller, sharper marks alongside, signs of young lions traveling with pride. The cub rested in a carrier slung at his side, its head turned slightly toward the open air, eyes half closed. The heat was already pressing down, and the journey would need to be measured, careful, and without waste. For over an hour, the tracks led through a broken patch of scrub, where thorn branches snagged at his trousers and small birds rose in brief flurries ahead of him. The air shimmered over the horizon. Each time the trail grew faint, he knelt to study the ground, searching for the faint pressed curves that would carry him onward. The prints grew fresher still, the edges sharper. Grains of disturbed sand yet to settle. The lions were close. As the land began to flatten, he saw movement far ahead. The shapes were low and tawny, shifting slowly through the heat haze. 4 adults, perhaps 5. They moved without hurry, their tails flicking occasionally at flies. At first, they seemed unremarkable, the slow, steady progress of pride in the hottest hours of the day. But then, at the rear, one shape lagged, its gait uneven. Even at distance, the limp was clear, the head carried low, the steps placed with care. The ranger stopped, lifting his binoculars to study her. The lioness's ribs showed faintly under her coat, her shoulders marked with the rise and fall of muscles straining to keep pace. She glanced back often, scanning the empty plain behind her. It was not the restless checking of a lioness on guard, but something quieter, more searching. The cub in the carrier shifted, pressing faintly against the fabric. The ranger looked down, the small ears tilted forward, the nostrils flaring in shallow breaths. Whether it recognized the scent or merely caught the smell of its kind again after days apart, he could not tell. But the timing was too close to dismiss. A pride with a limping lioness, moving without young at their side, meant only one thing. A separation had occurred. If this was its mother, her strength was falling fast. The longer they were apart, the less chance either had of surviving the season. The pride slowed near a line of scattered trees, some lying in the shade while others stood watch. The limping lioness lay apart from the group, her head resting against her foreleg. From this distance, the connection between her and the cub was still unproven, but the choice was clear. They were as close now as the open plain would allow without risking a chase or retreat. He adjusted the carrier at his side, feeling the small body inside shift again. The next move would decide whether this search brought reunion or nothing at all. The pride was resting, but the sun was climbing higher. The time to act was now, before heat or distance forced the moment to pass. The heat lay heavy over the plain, pressing down until even the air seemed to hold still. The pride rested in the thin, fractured shade of a scatter of acacia trees, their tawny coats blending with the pale grass. Flies circled lazily, settling on ears and noses before being flicked away by the slow sweep of tails. At the edge of the group, apart from the others, the limping lioness lay stretched along the ground. Her head rested on her foreleg, eyes half closed but alert beneath the stillness. The ranger stopped 100 meters out, the cub quiet in the carrier slung at his side. From here, the wind moved gently toward the trees, carrying his scent ahead. He crouched, lowering the carrier slowly to the ground. Every movement was deliberate, measured to avoid breaking the fragile balance of distance. He unfastened the carrier's top and folded the fabric aside. The cub's head lifted slightly, its nose moving as it caught the scent of the open plain. Its eyes blinked against the brightness. He slid his hands beneath its body, lifting it clear and setting it down on the bare earth. It stood uncertainly, the muscles in its legs trembling under its own weight. The sun lit the dull dust clinging to its fur, outlining the fine bones along its ribs. For a moment it stayed still, ears turning, head slightly lowered. Then it took a slow step forward, paused, and turned its head toward the trees. The movement drew the lioness's attention. Her head lifted, ears pricking forward. She stared, her eyes fixed on the small shape in the open. Around her, the pride shifted. One female sat upright, another rolled to her side, but none moved toward the cub. The air between them was bare and flat. No cover, No shadows deep enough to conceal anything. The lioness remained in place for a long breath. Then she pushed herself up, the limp clear in her first few steps. She moved slowly, her paws placing each step with care. Dust rose faintly around her legs. Her tail swayed once behind her, not in agitation but in slow balance. She advanced without sound, her gaze locked on the cub. Halfway across the gap, the cub gave a soft, broken sound. A rasp of breath more than a true call. It was weak, but it reached her. She stopped, head tilting slightly to one side, her ears forward, eyes still holding the cub. The distance between them held for a heartbeat before she moved again, shortening it with steady, deliberate steps. When she reached the cub, she lowered her head until her muzzle brushed along its side. She breathed in deeply, moving her nose along its flank, from shoulder to tail, then back again. She paused at the base of its neck, inhaling there for several long seconds. The cub leaned into her lightly, as if for balance, its legs still shaking but holding. Her posture shifted, her body curving protectively. She stood over the cub, her chest brushing its back, her shadow falling across the ground where it stood. Behind her, the pride watched. One of the younger females stepped from the shade, took a few paces forward, then stopped, her eyes flicking between the pair. The lioness did not turn, her focus fixed on the cub. The ranger stood still, his hands resting at his sides. Every sign in her body, the slow steps, the lowered head, the measured touch, spoke of recognition, not threat. Whether it was scent, faint memory, or the cub's small sound that had confirmed it, she knew this was hers. After a long moment, she pressed her muzzle gently to the cub's shoulder, nudging it forward. The movement was soft but insistent. The cub stepped ahead in small, awkward strides, keeping close to her legs. She followed close behind, her head low, eyes scanning the space between them and the trees. As they reached the shade, the pride shifted to make room. The younger female stepped back, and an older male lifted his head briefly before resting it again. The lioness guided the cub into the shallow shelter beneath a branch and lay beside it, her foreleg curling lightly over its back. The cub collapsed into the curve of her body, its sides moving in slow, steady breaths. The ranger let the sight fix itself in his mind, the stillness, the quiet, the space between the first step and the last now gone. He stepped back slowly, the heat of the plain still on his skin. The pride had closed around the pair, and nothing more was needed. The cub was no longer alone, and for now, the danger that had shadowed it since the day it fell behind was gone. The cub lay in the thin shade beneath the acacia, pressed into the curve of the lioness's foreleg. Its head rested against her chest, eyes half closed, the rise and fall of its breathing steadier now than it had been for days. Around them, the pride began to stir, drawn by the quiet movements at the tree's edge. One by one, they shifted from their resting places, their bodies sliding into a loose half-circle that enclosed the cub in a wall of tawny muscle and slow-moving tails. A young female approached first, her steps careful, head low. She paused just short of touching, her eyes fixed on the cub before settling beside it. The cub shifted slightly, leaning its small frame against her shoulder. She did not move away. Instead, she lowered her head until her muzzle brushed the top of its back, holding it there in stillness. The rest of the pride settled in positions that closed the space to the outside. Two older females lay flank to flank, their bodies blocking the light from one side. A subadult male sat upright at the rear, his gaze shifting between the open plain and the pair in the center. There was no tension in their movements, only the slow, deliberate placement of each body to form a living barrier. The lioness who had first approached the cub stood a short distance away, her body turned toward the ranger. Her eyes held steady on him, unblinking. Her stance was not aggressive, but it left no doubt that she was aware of his presence, that she had measured the space between them and found it worth guarding. Each time the cub shifted or lifted its head, her gaze flicked down before returning to him. Minutes passed in this quiet arrangement, the only sounds the rustle of grass in the wind and the soft exhale of breath from the pride. Then, slowly, the cub's head lifted higher. Its nose brushed along the foreleg of the lioness beside it, mouth opening slightly. The young female shifted, tilting her body so the cub could reach her. A faint suckling sound followed, soft but certain. The feeding was slow, each pull of the cub's mouth deliberate, its movements halting as it paused for breath. The pride remained still, their eyes watchful but calm. The older lioness's gaze softened fractionally, her head lowering a little as she continued to watch both the cub and the man standing beyond the circle. The ranger did not move, his hands still at his sides. The line of lions between him and the cub was unbroken, their bodies forming a boundary that was both shield and warning. In the shade, the cub fed on, each swallow another step back from the edge it had hovered over for so long. When it finally rested, its head dropped again to the curve of the young female's shoulder. She shifted slightly to support its weight, her eyes half closed now, the shared warmth between them easing both into stillness. The lioness at the front of the circle gave one last long look toward the ranger. Then she turned, stepping into the shade to lie near the cub's back, her body completing the enclosure. In that moment, the pride became a single shape, joined, watchful, and whole, and the cub, for the first time in days, lay at the center of safety. The sun hung low over the plain, its light spilling gold across the grass until every blade seemed to burn at the edges. The air had cooled just enough for the pride to stir, slow movements breaking the stillness that had held through the heat of the afternoon. One by one, they rose from the shade of the acacia, stretching long, silent limbs before turning toward the open land. The cub stood unsteadily, swaying as it found its feet. It was thinner than the others, its legs too light beneath it, but it stepped forward when the lioness nudged its shoulder. The young female who had let it lean against her earlier moved alongside, her flank brushing the cubs as they began to walk. The rest of the pride arranged themselves around them without a sound, their formation loose but clear, the cub at the center, guarded on all sides. Dust lifted beneath their paws, catching in the fading light. The pride's movement was unhurried, each step measured, conserving energy for the long stretch ahead. The cub stumbled once, its small head dipping low, but the lioness pressed against it until it found its balance again. Her limp was still there, but she kept her pace steady, never falling behind. The ranger stood where the shade met the light, watching them cross the open space. The lioness glanced back once, her eyes meeting him over the distance. It was not a long look, just enough to hold for a moment, then break as she turned forward again. The gap between them widened with every step, the sound of their movement soft against the wind. The grass ahead grew taller, the gold deepening as the sun slid closer to the horizon. The pride began to fade into it, their bodies dissolving into the shifting patterns of light and shadow. First, the backs of the younger lions disappeared, then the taller shapes of the older females. The cub was the last to be seen clearly, its smaller form framed between the legs of the lioness as they moved deeper into the grass. By the time the sun touched the edge of the land, they were gone, swallowed entirely by the evening plain. The dust they had stirred settled slowly, hanging in the air before falling back to the earth. The heat of the day bled away into the cooling wind, carrying the faint rustle of grass where they had passed. The ranger remained still for a long while, his eyes tracing the line where grass met sky. The moment of reunion had passed into movement, and movement into distance, but the image held, the cub walking in the center of its pride, each step a return to the life it had nearly lost. As the last light drained from the horizon, the plain grew quiet again. Only the soft whisper of wind over the grass remained, and in it, the memory of a small body lifted from the dust and carried back, step by step, to where it belonged.